As it turns out, the BBC is very fluid with their interpretation of copyright law and very overprotective of their intellectual property. Each time I do a video with any amount of copyright material, I have to warp it, zoom in, zoom out, mirror image, and in general fuck up the video, in a vain attempt to avoid copyright bots. So instead of putting myself through that again, I'm just going to use telesnaps. Back in the 60s, people took photographs of their TV screens and took audio recordings. Home media wasn't exactly a thing beyond the vinyl disc or film reels, and the BBC certainly weren't interested in cultural preservation. We owe a lot to these 1960s nerds. To this day, telesnap reconstructions are the only way to watch some episodes.
What have I come upon?
In other words, I'm using screenshots in place of footage. I won't be able to provide proper context with some of my critiques, but I can also make the characters look as derpy as I like. So, good on you, BBC. You're really protecting your intellectual property there. Isn't it a little bit weird that we get all this hype for the next era when the current one isn't technically finished yet? I'm not the biggest fan of the Chibnal era. It was very much a mixed bag for me, as it was for a lot of us. I like Jodie as the Doctor, but she suffers from inconsistent characterization and poor direction, as if each person filming or directing an episode had a different idea of what this incarnation should be. The companions are great. I love Ryan, I love Yaz, I love Graham, I love Dan! But like the Doctor, they suffer from the same inconsistency in characterization. There are some really good episodes there, but frankly there's also really awful ones I look forward to losing my shit at. Some episodes would be instant classics, while others would have the Doctor side with tyrannical power structures that only function through the exploitation and abuse of the working class. Yeah, the Doctor shilling for Space Amazon. Not a fan. But for every kablam, we get something like the Witchfinders. For every Orphan 55, we get a Demons of the Punjab. And for every Timeless Children, you'll get something iconic. An episode like Rosa. Before we begin, obvious spoiler warnings. Also trigger warnings! There's a lot of depictions of racially motivated violence and bigotry in this episode that some would find distressing. And if you're one of those people who cringe at the mention of trigger warnings, can you just grow up? Not everybody is as resilient as you, Michael. I also want to point out that I am a white person from a country with its own history of oppression, exploitation, and slavery to non-white people. So, if I cause offense out of ignorance, I assure you it is out of ignorance. I apologize in advance. Please let me know in the comments. I am a flawed person, and I always aim to improve. Rosa is an episode that celebrates just how far we've come, while acknowledging just how much further we have to go. It centers around the character Rosa Parks, a civil rights activist prominent in the American civil rights movement, famous for her pivotal role in the Montgomery bus boycott, when she refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. For this egregious act, she was arrested for violating segregation laws. She wasn't the first to do this, but the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People believed that she was the perfect candidate for a court challenge to her arrest. Her action inspired the black community of Montgomery to boycott the buses for over a year, and eventually the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Her act of defiance became an important symbol in the movement, making her an international icon, and she continued her activism right into her old age, commenting that there was still so much more to be done. I didn't know about Rosa Parks until I saw this episode, and that's one thing I love about Chibnal Who. The fact that he takes the show back to its roots, and uses it as a vehicle to educate the audience on historical characters like her. So we join the Doctor and her companions on their adventures as the Doctor is trying to get her companions home. But, as we know, the TARDIS has a mind of its own, taking the Doctor not where she really wants to go, but always where she needs to be. But this time she simply can't read the controls. It's unknown how many times she's failed to get them home at this point, but I like to think that there's enough room there for at least 2 Big Finish box sets. This time they find themselves in the deep south of the United States, in the state of titty-fucking Alabama, in a town called Montgomery in the year 1955. Not exactly the best place for everyone on board the TARDIS, especially in this day and age. Anyway, the Doctor has detected some Artron energy, so instead of giving Elvis a call, like Graham wanted to, they have to go out and investigate. They're having a good old look around when Ryan sees a lady drop her glove. Upon returning it to her, her husband smacks him in the face. And this is when the episode gets confronting. The depiction of systemic and ingrained racism in this episode is as brilliant as it is uncomfortable. And it really should be. That sort of bigotry happened all the time back then. It wasn't because people back then are just horrible people. People aren't racist because they are horrible people. They are horrible people because they are racist. And they are racist because of how they were socialized. They've all been raised in it, molded by it. It's how everyone around them acts. That's the horrible thing about bigotry. You don't realize you're doing it, so you don't question it. You accept it as just the way things are, and people in general are very resistant to change, especially if it means admitting that you might be wrong about something. I'm not saying to justify any of this, I just think that it's a good idea to understand how bigoted people think. It's a very good defense against becoming one yourself. Anyway, Rosa shows up and saves Ryan from this guy, and tells off our heroes for being so bloody stupid. Black people disappear and are found dead all the time in this town, and it's usually after they have talked to a white lady. Upon finding out who she is, the Doctor, Graham and Yaz fangirl over her for a bit, and she tells them to get the hell out of town. As she's walking off, the Doctor not too subtly gives her a scan. It turns out Rosa Parks is drenched in Artron energy, which means that someone has been fucking with her history. So they go to the local pub, and we discover that Ryan, despite having a nan who idolized her, has no clue who Rosa Parks is. I kinda love this, because if Ryan has one consistent character trait, it's that he's just a little bit thick, but in a lovable way. That just makes you want to pat him on the head and tell him he's doing a good job. It reminds me a lot of Jamie. But before our heroes can get something to eat, they are thrown out because of racism, leaving Graham really hungry. They trace the Artron signal to a warehouse at a bus depot. They unlock the suspicious number of locks on the door and enter the warehouse. And inside this warehouse they find a box. And inside that box they find timey-wimey tools and stuff. It's not too long before someone is shooting at them, so they run for their lives and hide behind some fuel tanks. And the Doctor gets on top of things and confronts their would-be attacker, who recognizes her as a fellow time traveler. Jodie demands authority in this scene. It's the most competent we've seen her so far. It has little to no effect on 50s McCheese. He is our villain for the evening. The Doctor recognizes his weapon as a temporal displacement device, and notices that he's wearing a vortex manipulator. The guy reminds me of several people I've met before. That smug confidence in their own sense of superiority, secure in their worldview that they are superior, and there's no possible way they could possibly be mistaken. What seems to be a running trend, he tells them to get out of town. The Doctor tells him to fuck off and stop fucking with Rosa Parks, and then they all regroup at a crummy hotel. A whites-only crummy hotel, where Yaz and Ryan are forced to sneak in through the window. Now, everybody open your books to page 13 because school is in session and the Doctor is giving a lesson. They try to think about everything they can remember about Rosa Parks, so they can follow her around and discover how her timeline is being changed. They only figure out her profession before Sergeant Fucknuggle knocks on the door. It's the police! And the Doctor and Graham have to pretend to be a couple, while Ryan and Yaz jump out the window. It's now time for touchy-feely time. In Chibnal Who, there's always a dedicated few minutes where the characters exposit how the events of the episode makes them feel, rather than communicating this visually or weaving it through the narrative in a more natural way. Ryan is 100% done with this shit and laments that nothing has really changed. Racism didn't end with Rosa Parks, and in a way he is right. The victory of the American Civil Rights Movement wasn't ending racism, it was gaining some sort of equality and recognition under the law. The bigger battle is a social one that is still being fought today, convincing people who for generations have been conditioned by society and their elders to see people of colour as lesser, and get them to see them as equals instead. That's a massive undertaking, and it takes generations to achieve. Yaz points this out, that yes, racism is still a thing, but the actions of Rosa and the Civil Rights Movement have paved the way for real lasting change, even to the point that a black man was elected president of the United States 53 years later. It's kind of undercut by the fact that an orange man who thrives in division deepened the racial divides afterwards, setting the country back decades, but it's still a touching scene. But now that the coast is clear, they figure out where Rosa works and the route she takes, and they are all set to start stalking her. So they take a bus ride with Rosa Parks. They chat for a bit, and Ryan follows her home. Graham goes to the pub to hang out with the racist bus driver, and the Doctor goes to have a chat with 50s McCheese. So they do, and Ryan scares the crap out of Rosa because he is way too fucking obvious. But that's okay, she calms down when he says that he wants to help the cause. So he gets to hang out with Martin Luther King while sitting in on their meeting, fanboying the whole while. Meanwhile, the Doctor is having a chat with 50s McCheese, and learns through deduction that he's from thousands of years in the future. Was an inmate of the Storm Cage, the same prison that River Song was constantly escaping from, to go out on dates with the man that she is sentenced for killing. He claims to be a mass murderer, but it's okay, honest, seriously, he's completely rehabilitated, honest. Pinky swear. He's actually there to stop Rosa from doing her protest, because according to him, that's when things started to go wrong. But he can't just kill her, even though he'd really like to. The storm cage implanted a bioinhibitor chip into his skull to keep him from hurting people. He can't kill, so he got his hands on some time travel tech, went back, and decided to start nudging events, changing things just enough so that Rosa Parks would never be in that situation in the first place. She would never protest, and civil rights in America wouldn't happen. This episode is brilliant, I stand by that assessment. But the villain makes no damn sense. He wants to stop the civil rights movement from happening. Okay, let's say he succeeds. What's stopping Rosa from doing her protest on another night? Is he committed to following this woman around for the rest of her life to keep her from sitting down on a bus? What's stopping someone else in the movement from doing it? The American Civil Rights Movement wasn't just a few people. It was a movement involving massive amounts of people throughout the country and throughout the world. Just in that same town of Montgomery, there was a black woman named Lucille Times. She also had a run-in with James Blake, the bus driver who called the cops on Rosa Parks when she did her protest. He had shouted insults at her and harassed her and tried to drive her off the road simply for being a black woman driving a car. When her complaints to the bus company went nowhere, she took to driving her car ahead of the bus timetable and giving black passengers free rides, effectively starting a boycott 6 months before Rosa Parks. If the NAACP didn't challenge her arrest in the Supreme Court, they would have done it for someone else. If anything, all 50s McCheese would achieve is changing the date of the protest, or the person who did it. And for that matter, why is this guy from the far future, when humans are going around fucking aliens, have the same race-based bigotry of today? Bigotry isn't some static thing, it changes with the culture. For example, in ancient Greece and Rome, it didn't matter if you had sex with a man. Rather than discriminating on that basis, they discriminated against people based on the role that they performed in the act. So tops versus bottoms rather than gays versus straights. His culture's bigotry would be something completely different that makes just as much sense. Is he a bigotry hipster? Knowing that 50s McCheese can't do anything to her, the Doctor rips the vortex manipulator off his arm and smashes it, taunting him the whole while. I love how dark this incarnation can be. She seems like a friendly children's TV presenter, but that's just a mask she wears to hide the cold, calculating manipulator underneath with a massive mean streak, using her femininity to her advantage, letting people underestimate her while she plots their downfall. It's in these moments that we see the Doctor's true self, highly confident and intelligent, playing 26D chess with the universe. We see an example of this later on when the team regroup in the hotel, and the Doctor tells Ryan how to operate 50 McCheese's temporal displacement gun thing. While hanging out with James Blake at the pub, Graham found out that he's got the day off. 50s McCheese changed the bus schedule, so Blake isn't working the night of Rosa's protest. The Doctor counters by telling the other bus driver that he's won an all-expenses-paid trip to Las Vegas to meet Frank Sinatra. The Doctor called it a favour, because, of course she knows Frank. She's just lucky that Elvis lent him that cell phone that she gave him. Then she rips her coat so they can get Rosa to fix it. So Yaz has an excuse to hang out with her for the day and make sure that she gets on the bus right on time. It's up to Graham and Ryan to make Blake go back to work by annoying him at his favourite fishing spot and telling him there's going to be a protest. But 50s McCheese counters by smashing up the bus. But that's okay, they found a spare! And now it's up to Ryan and Graham to make sure people are catching the bus so Rosa will be expected to move and give up her seat. Because 50s put notices around town saying the route was cancelled. But it looks like Rosa is going to miss the bus. She said that she's okay with walking, but then she doesn't, because Yaz rushes her out the door. But oh no, 50s McCheese, in a last-ditch effort, has decided to just block the road, while being a racist twat towards Ryan, who in response uses the temporal displacement gun to send him as far back as he can. Ryan just killed a guy. He killed a guy, and the Doctor isn't only okay with it, she subtly manipulated him into doing it. He was sent back as far as the dial would go, and we don't know the range on that thing. He could be eaten by a dinosaur, he could be suffocated or roasted alive on a pre-life Earth, he could be vaporized in the hot period right after the Big Bang. And yes, he could have wound up in a nice, safe period with plenty of food and plenty of water, but we don't know. 50s McCheese was a dangerous racist ass, but the Doctor is supposed to be a pacifist. She's not supposed to be okay with this. Is this incarnation of the Doctor just not okay with murder when guns are involved? Any other method will do? That doesn't matter though, the bus is full and there's nothing stopping them from getting this woman arrested, which means that they have to stay on the bus and watch it happen, completely unable to help her. So Rosa is told to move and she refuses. It's all very well done.
If you don't stay, I'm gonna have you arrested.
You may do that.
I just wish they didn't play this cloying pop music over the top of it. There are many sources, some better than others, that claim that Rosa Parks had staged the entire event, that it was a planned protest. After all, she wasn't the first one to do it, she was just the first one that a lot of people paid attention to. And meaning no disrespect to those brave individuals who stood up to injustice by refusing to stand, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? History is never as simple as a great woman did a great thing. It's nuanced, messy, and not all that inspiring. Rosa Parks may not be the first person to do a protest, but she was the first one to be mates with Martin Luther King. She was the first one to be prominent enough in the community that people took notice. So even if the entire thing was staged, in my personal opinion, and it's just my opinion, it doesn't really matter that much. It's the story that inspires people. We are all stories in the end. It's her story that inspired the bus boycott. It's her story that inspires people to stand up to oppression even to this day. She inspires not just people of colour, but every oppressed minority. Leaders of the gay rights movements were heavily influenced by her and Martin Luther King, and all the great champions for change. Even here in Australia, it's stories that change minds, that persuade people to sympathise. And her story still inspires people to this day. We close out the episode with the Doctor and her fam in the TARDIS. She's telling her companions the end of Rosa's story, telling about the hardships she faced and how she kept fighting regardless, paving the way for real change, and someone named a rock after her.
Oh look! Rocks!
Overall, I love this episode. It's a loving homage to an incredible woman. I just wish it didn't sometimes feel like an episode of The Magic School Bus. The villain was lazy and underdeveloped, and overall unnecessary. What is New Who's problem with pure historicals, where the only sci-fi elements are the Doctor and the TARDIS? Big Finish do them all the time, and they're brilliant. Just have the Doctor and her companions run into Rosa Parks and accidentally change something in her chronology through stupidity or ignorance, and the episode doesn't change. We also wouldn't have to deal with the implication that modern-day black-white racism survives thousands of years into the future, as if it's something innate that will always be with us, and frankly, that's just horrifying. Thanks for the view, and like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. If I offended people in this video, really, I'm sorry. But like and subscribe.